floor is yours.
Great. Do you have a little clicker?
We do.
Fabulous.
Now it's working.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Berglund, and my thesis is called "They Know Not What They View." What I'm studying today is Christian filmmaking. Specifically, my joke with people for the last year, as I've been working on this, is when they ask about my thesis, is I say, well, in slightly more academic terms, it's I'm trying to figure out why Christian movies are so bad. Obviously, that's a little bit glib about this, but I was very interested in it for a couple of reasons. One, I've always been really interested in film, and like many of you in this room and on this call, very interested in theology, and specifically how art has the power to form people. And I started thinking about the fact that, like, if you watch a 2-hour movie, that's more time than some people are going to spend in church all week. And so what are they getting from that? What are these movies doing as an effect? So let's dive into that. So first off, we need to define what are evangelical films. So just to clarify things, it's not just any film about religion. It's not even necessarily any Christian or biblical film. So for instance, we're leaving out biblical ethics like the Ten Commandments and Passion of Christ, Christian fantasy films like the Chronicles of Narnia series, or Catholic films like Silence or The Last Temptation of Christ. These films are by and large produced by different forces and are doing different things than what we're talking about here. So what is an evangelical film? Evangelical films are produced by the intersection of independent, evangelically minded filmmakers, often supported in recent years by major studio financing and distribution. So it's this weird sort of merging of like the indie Christian grassroots space and like major Hollywood budgets and stars that they can attach for like cheap amounts of money. You might be familiar with some of these movies. The Kendrick brothers created Face of the Giants, Fireproof, War Room. We've got Pure Flix Entertainment, that's most famous for the God's Not Dead series. You didn't know there were that many God's Not Dead movies, did you? And then we've got most recently the Erwin brothers, who made things like I Can Only Imagine, I Still Believe, or most recently American Underdog, the Kurt Warner story. So the thing about these movies is, ever since Passion of Christ proved that Christian films can make money, these films are increasingly popular and being widely distributed by Hollywood. And over the last 15 years, 20 of them made over $10 million, and 6 made over $50 million, which I will point out, both those amounts of money are more than many films that were nominated at the Oscars for Best Picture last week. So these films are not like Disney Marvel style earners, but they're doing pretty well for themselves. The problem, of course, is that these movies are often very poorly reviewed and rarely seen or applauded in non-evangelical circles. So the natural research question becomes, why are these movies so bad? It's a little glib. The real research question is here. What are these movies attempting to accomplish? So for instance, are these movies just meant to be evangelistic tools? Feels bad to compare them to like art house indie films if what they're really trying to do is save souls for Jesus. Are the quality issues a result of inexperienced outsiders making films on a major stage? These people have never touched a camera before 20 years ago, so of course they're not great. Or a result of problematic narratives and theology? And the answer to that question is yes. And what can we theologically glean about the state of evangelicalism in America based on the films that they are producing and consuming? We're going to get to the theology. There's a lot here. This whole thing was like 50 pages originally, so we're going to just fly on the roller coaster through this. You can ask any questions during the Q&A, and if we don't have time in the Q&A, just ask me afterward. I'll email you the whole thing. So some motifs. So basically, my research process on this was for about 2 weeks before the start of the fall semester, I watched 20 straight evangelical Christian films. An amount of viewing akin to binging the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, but of films like God's Not Dead 2. I went through a lot of soul searching during that time, but I also noticed 9 motifs that show up over and over again in these films, much the same way as cowboy hats show up in Western films all the time. So some of these ones are, the heroes of these movies are often white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, and Christian, and the conflicts they face are usually domestic in scope. What that means is they are not trying to stop the terrorist bomb, they are trying to like save their marriage or something. Women may be major characters, may be the main character of these, but they are always relegated to being wife, mother, or daughter in this. There's only one of the 20 films I watched where a woman's career outside of the home was remotely relevant to the plot of the movie. There's also limited minority representation. In general, people of color just don't show up in these movies. There are literally no queer characters in any of these films. It's not, they're bad guys, they just don't exist in these movies. And black characters show up the most often, and so of course they are the most often heavily stereotyped characters. Characters have generic interiority and appear to function basically as viewer self-inserts. So everyone is very vanilla. You are meant to imagine them as a blank slate you can project yourself onto, like they're the object of like a sermon metaphor, usually. No one wants specific things. No one is like really concerned about the Kirkman account or something like that. They want like, I want to be a good dad, and it doesn't get much more specific than that, usually. In addition, most protagonists never undergo a full character arc in the traditional dramatic sense. So in a normal movie or story of any sort, you know, the character has a problem at the beginning, and then they grow and they change and they learn how to fix that problem in themselves, and they're a better person at the end. By contrast, a third of the heroes of Christian films just never change over the course of the movie, and the end of the movie is like, you were right the whole time, which is weird on a story level. In addition, most character arcs conclude prior to and separate from the film's climactic events, which basically means that like a person will like, if they do grow and change, they stop growing and changing with like 30 minutes left in the movie. So functionally, the story is over, but the movie's still gonna keep going. In addition, majority of evangelical films feature a conversion or altar call scene. You probably predicted that. Though rarely for the main character, who, as we said, is already Christian. So usually there's like a fantasy of like, I'm bringing my friend to Jesus as a crucial scene in the movie. Most evangelical films generally avoid direct depictions of violence, sex, language, and other sins. And this doesn't mean that they don't try and engage with these materials. Fully 2 of these movies had entire involved storylines about gang violence in like the inner city, and could not show any violence or any language in these. And the scenes play weird for that reason, as you might expect. Evangelical films feature heavy use of montage and monologue. There's an average of 3.5 montages in a Christian film. And monologue, a lot of times there'll be like a scene at the end of the movie where like a voiceover, or literally someone just gets up in a pulpit at church and explains for 5 minutes what the moral of the movie was at the end. 8, God often functions as an active but unseen participant or character in the stories of evangelical films, often in the form of direct or indirect divine intervention. So direct is like, this person is raised from the dead. Indirect being like, this person prayed for something at the beginning of the movie, and by the end of the movie, that thing happened, and is clearly being attributed that way. Only 1 of the 20 did not have one of those 2 things happen. And number 9, most evangelical films address theodicy, the problem of like, how can a good God allow pain and suffering, either directly or indirectly, which is weird because they're not equipped to handle this based on the answers they give most of the times in these movies. So, takeaways from all of this, because that was a lot there. Based on these motifs, evangelical film's primary goal seems to be inspiring viewers to become better Christians. What a noble goal. What does that mean? So, that's what brings us to the theology of these films. So, by and large, they almost always have an atonement model of salvation, as opposed to liberation or Catholic or other schools of thought on how salvation comes apart. Is always, Jesus died for your sins to forgive you, that sort of thing. What are we saved from? Unclear in these movies. So if you're just reading the movies at face value, they don't explain that. Specifically, hell, spiritual warfare, and the devil are all almost entirely absent in these movies. There are no oppressive powers. There are no other forces. There are no things. Basically, the same way that salvation is a personal choice, sin is a personal choice. So just stop sinning. And there we go. What do we hope in? Also unclear in these movies, because they do believe heaven is a real place. There's a movie called Heaven is for Real, is one of the ones I had to watch. But in general, there's no discussion of what heaven will be like or what we're hoping for. There's no discussion of a new heaven and new earth, a new Jerusalem, a judgment day, a second coming of Christ. And all rewards and prayers are given out and answered in the material world here and now within the scope of the movie. There's also a limited understanding of sacraments and ecclesial life. Baptisms are not in these movies. Communion are not in these movies. And ecclesial life is, you go to church on Sunday morning, and sometimes you have a relationship with the pastor and you talk to him in his office. That's about it. God empowers the believer to live better and be more holy. That seems great. implied is that the Holy Spirit's doing this, but they would never say that in these movies specifically. It's just God. In general, all of the Trinity just gets compressed down to God in these movies in discussion. And then finally, there's a distinct lack of empathy for non-Christians, and this is maybe the thing that you have heard from things like God's Not Dead or stuff like that, where basically no one can be a good person and not believe in God in these movies. Either God hurt them, they're angry at God, God did something to screw them over basically, or they just like hate Christians so much. There is one character who is a generally good person who is not a Christian across 20 of these movies. Everyone else who's not a Christian is a bad person, by and large. Some implications of this. Christian kitsch art. So Nathaniel set this up very well on his, so I don't have to go super in-depth about this. But the idea of these movies often present very difficult situations and offer really simple, basic answers that don't actually grapple with the complexities of what's happening. And this has the problem of distorting one's theological worldview by removing their need to wrestle with anything difficult that would actually, make them a better Christian and help their faith to grow. And over the last 2 decades, this is notable. Christian films have dramatically risen in overall production quality. So people are getting more experience. The quality on a cinematography, camera, music, all that level, so much better now. But still having the same story problems, which were noted in the motifs before. And finally, just more radical changes maybe necessary theologically, based on that entire theology slide we just did before, where it's like, hey, we may need to rethink how we tell stories in this framework here, or even if the idea of let's make someone a better Christian by watching this movie is a good goal for a movie to have. Is the goal of it to ask questions? Is it to save people? There's a lot of possible things you could do with it that are not what they're doing now. So that is the full presentation. It's a lot to go through, so I imagine some of you may have questions on that. But yeah.
So, this is all kind of aggressively interesting. And one thing, it seems like the upshot from why are these films bad at a basic level is that they don't know how to tell stories. Why don't they know how to tell stories?
It's a great
question.
question.
Most of these people have grown up eating the Chronicles of Narnia for breakfast. Mm-hmm. And those are some very well told stories. What is lost in translation?
Yeah, no, a big part of what I found in these was just that the storytelling and the script quality is lagging behind. And I think it's, if I was guessing, it's probably a couple things. It's one, approaching storytelling in movies from a moral first instead of thinking through it on a narrative standpoint of what would characters want, what would they be doing. You're trying to build to a moral, so you're really writing not a movie, but a sermon illustration that's 90 minutes long. But also, I think paired with that is a fear that they want this to be relatable to absolutely everyone, except that generally what makes a character most interesting and that you relate to the most is when they have particularities, when there's something special and distinct about them. You don't remember blank slate characters being your favorite character ever because they're just like you. You remember very particular, goofy, interesting characters. So that would be my guess, but it's a good question. You have a question?
Yeah, so I was wondering if you explored sort of the influence that capitalism had on all this, of the Christian market is obviously very strong if they're raking in $10 to $50 million for these somewhat crappy movies.
Yeah.
So could it be that the motivation for somewhat lagging in storytelling and production is that you don't have to work as hard because there's not as much competition, and also potentially that the quality is getting better because Hollywood has realized that this is a money-making industry?
I think that's all very accurate. I think I would also add into there that exactly, you see the production quality going up because Hollywood is investing money in this, and that's a big difference from say Kirk Cameron in Left Behind in 2000, which has a budget of $10 or something. But I also think that there's a level as well of, as long as Christian audiences, evangelical audiences, keep going to these films and enjoying them without them needing to be good stories, there's not really a need for them to reevaluate it and make something better instead, because they're well, this works, this is the formula, sort of. Yeah, are there any questions in the chat?
No, just some comments, maybe we can revisit them, but we're actually sort of butting up against your time here.
Great.
So thank you so much, Taylor.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, with all of these, we need a